the Iron Haven. Have you ever had to choose between your dignity and your survival? This is the true story of a woman who lost everything in a single afternoon and found something far more valuable in the most unexpected place. It was December 1884 in Wyoming. Margaret stood in front of the house that had been her home for 6 years, but now the door was closed forever. Beside her, her 8-year-old son Thomas trembled. Neither wore more than the clothes on their backs. No coats, no money, no food. Just the two of them and the frozen silence of a town that had already decided whose side it was on. Everything had exploded over an innocent letter. The schoolteacher congratulated Thomas on his progress in arithmetic and asked if Margaret might help organize the library. Nothing more, but Raymond had been drinking since morning, and in his alcohol-soaked mind, those polite words became proof of betrayal. He grabbed her arm hard enough to leave purple marks, dragged her to the door, and slammed it so hard that Margaret knew there was no going back. Now she walked through the outskirts of town with nowhere to go. No money, no family nearby, and worst of all, Raymond had already told his version. Margaret saw it in the faces of neighbors who looked away. Then she saw the railroad yard, that place she'd passed 1,000 times without noticing. Rusted tracks, abandoned freight cars. But now, with Thomas's hand freezing in hers, she saw it with different eyes. The eyes of someone desperate. There was an old boxcar, alone, forgotten on a sidetrack. It had been red once, but the years had turned it to rust. No one had touched it in years. No footprints in the snow. It was as abandoned as they were. Margaret approached, trembling. What if it was locked? The door resisted at first, frozen by rust. Then it shrieked open. Inside was darkness and the smell of old wood. But it was dry, completely dry, and empty. Blessedly, wonderfully empty. "Is this where we're staying?" Thomas asked, his voice very small in the empty space. "Yes," Margaret said, making the decision as she spoke. "This is our new home." That first night she didn't sleep. She planned. At dawn she studied their shelter with new eyes. The boxcar was sturdy. Thick walls. The gaps between boards could be sealed. The elevated floor would protect them from the cold. This could work. This had to work. And so the transformation began. Margaret and Thomas became explorers of the town dump. What respectable people discarded, they reclaimed. A cracked mirror but still useful. Pieces of burlap for insulation. Newspapers. A pot. Scraps of wool. Nails. Thomas proved especially good at finding nails, his young eyes sharp and his small fingers nimble. In the rail yard they found more treasures. Coal fallen from freight cars. Dirty but dry straw. Torn tarp. Broken crates. Margaret stuffed the burlap into wall gaps. Layered newspapers over it. Her fingers were stiff and aching, but she didn't stop. The greatest challenge was fire. Margaret had 3 matches. Only 3. 3 chances to create the warmth that would keep them alive. She used the first to test whether the boxcar could safely contain fire without burning down around them. She built a small fire pit with flat stones she'd carried one by one from the creek. When she struck the match, her hands shook. The smoke rose naturally toward the roof. She discovered that by partially opening the door and creating a small gap near the roof on the opposite side, she could create a draft that pulled the smoke out efficiently. The boxcar had become a chimney. The fire transformed everything. Heat pushed back the deadly cold. The metal walls began to hold warmth. Color returned to Thomas's cheeks. But hunger was worse than cold. The first days they ate nothing at all. On the 3rd day, Margaret swallowed her pride and went to the hotel kitchen. Mrs. Chun, the cook, had heard Raymond's version. But her expression softened when she saw Thomas, thin and cold, trying to be brave. Without a word, she gave her a pot of stew she claimed was burnt. The stew was perfectly fine. From that day forward, Mrs. Chun burnt pots regularly. Margaret also set snares near the creek. Thomas learned to check them each morning. They caught rabbits, occasionally squirrels. Margaret saved every part. The meat for eating, the pelts for warmth, the sinew for sewing, the bones for broth. Nothing was wasted. The boxcar continued to evolve. Margaret built a raised sleeping platform with straw underneath for insulation. She created storage with stacked crates, made a curtain for the doorway that reduced drafts. What had been an empty boxcar now had distinct areas: sleeping space, cooking area, storage, and a corner for Thomas where he kept his slate and books. Because yes, even in the midst of survival, Thomas thought about education. He found a slate at the dump. Margaret got chalk. In the evenings, by lamplight she'd traded rabbit pelts for. She taught her son. They read poetry from a water-damaged book. Thomas practiced his letters while Margaret sewed. Because Margaret had started a small business. She did mending and alterations for coins. Mrs. Chun had mentioned that Margaret was skilled with a needle. Soon she was repairing dresses, darning socks, hemming trousers. The coins accumulated slowly. With them she bought a pot without holes, flour, a blanket that didn't come from the dump. Each purchase made life a little more dignified. As winter gave way toward spring, something changed. The townspeople began to speak differently about Margaret and her son. The initial scandal faded, replaced by respect. She'd survived winter in a boxcar, raised her son, built a business, and emerged not broken, but stronger. In March, Margaret made a decision. She filed papers claiming the boxcar as abandoned property. The railroad had forgotten it existed. Possession was 9/10 of the law. When the deed came through in April, Margaret wept. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming reality that she owned something. This boxcar, this home she'd built from nothing, was legally hers. With spring came new life. Margaret planted a garden beside the boxcar, built a small porch, made a rain barrel, cut windows in the walls, made curtains, painted the exterior with paint she'd mixed herself. The boxcar transformed from abandoned equipment to genuine home. One warm May evening, Margaret and Thomas sat on their small porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of orange and purple. The boxcar behind them glowed in the light, solid and real. Smoke from their cooking fire drifted upward, carrying the smell of rabbit stew that Thomas had caught. "I like our home," Thomas said simply. "So do I," Margaret replied. The boxcar had been their fortress against cold, hunger, and society's judgment. But it had become something more. It had been proof that they could survive anything, that they could take what the world discarded and make it valuable, that they could build a life on their own terms. Because in the end, home isn't what others give you. It's what you build with your own hands, determination, and love. And that night, as darkness settled over Wyoming, a mother and son rested in the home they'd created, secure in the knowledge that no matter what challenges came, they had the strength to face them. If this story touched your heart, leave me a comment telling me what you would do in that situation. And if you know someone who needs to remember their own strength, share this video. Sometimes the best stories aren't the ones with perfect endings, but the ones that remind us we're stronger than we believe.